Okay, I'm happy to open the conference on U.S. policy in the Middle East. This conference was co-organized by the Arnold Zaltzman Institute for War and Peace and the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. I have been involved in organizing many conferences, and I had relations with a variety of academics. And I'm truly happy to say that this one was one of the easiest. Professor Richard Betts and Professor Austin Long were great partners. We had a very amicable relationship, and anybody that knows academic life should appreciate it. At this stage, we have to acknowledge the support for this conference of the Dorothy and Harold Greenwald Foundation. In Hebrew, we have a proverb, Im en kemach en Torah. It translates rather well into English. Without dough, there is no learning. I hope that all of us will come out of here with a bit more knowledge about the relationship between the United States and the Middle East. This is a very important subject. And I will confess that I'm not Catholic in any way. Many things that, we have a lot of power in the world. But Bessa was not involved in organizing the turmoil in the Middle East in order to generate greater interest in the conference. So it's my pleasure now to call upon Professor Betts, the host here at Columbia, to welcome you. Professor Betts.
Well, on behalf of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, I welcome you to a day of reflection, commentary, and exchange of ideas on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Of course, this region was at the top of the American agenda when Professor Inbar proposed this conference some months ago, and recent dramatic events have only accentuated that importance. I want to thank Professor Inbar and the Begin-Sadat Center and the Greenwald Foundation for making the conference possible. Of course, we can't explore the full range of Middle East issues in detail today. We'll focus on two general sets of high-priority problems, the Arab-Israel conflict and the Persian Gulf, and how the United States can deal with them. The individual speakers today have their own views and can argue them with conviction. Of course, the university and SIPA and the Saltzman Institute don't have institutional positions on foreign policy issues and make no assumptions about the validity of any policy judgments. We'll hear today. We have a jam-packed agenda, so I'm not going to waste any more time blessing this event. I'll only say that we'll try to keep the panelists on time in order to leave time for audience questions. And we'll keep the breaks between sessions shorter than the norm for conferences. I hope you look forward, as I do, to as wide as possible a discussion with no thoughtful arguments or points of view out of bounds.
Thank you, Professor Betts. I would like to call upon my colleague, Professor Eitan Gilboa. He's Professor of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and he also has an appointment at the University of Southern California. And he will speak about Obama and the Israeli political conflict, Israeli-Arab conflict.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'll devote my presentation to the view from Jerusalem about Obama's policy in the Middle East, in particular toward the Arab-Israeli conflict in the context of the dramatic recent events of violence and revolt against existing regimes in the Middle East. I want to say from the beginning that both Israel and the United States are facing very serious and difficult challenges, and the problem is that there aren't good options to deal with them. Nobody knows how and when the present violence and events and when and how they will end, but several preliminary lessons are emerging. what is happening now. I'll make a few statements about Obama's policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. First, it's now almost obvious that the Israeli-Palestinian and the Israeli-Arab conflict are not the most important issue in the Middle East. Iran's ambitions, authoritarian regimes, and Islamic fundamentalism are much more. It's not the main source of instability. If there are any linkages between the Arab-Israeli conflict and other problems in the Middle East, they run and move exactly in the opposite direction of what has been suggested by the United States in recent years. The United States' approach to the recent turmoil has been confusing and inconsistent to many peoples and observers in the Middle East, to both allies and rivals alike. Too many leaders in the Middle East are asking what the United States really want to achieve in the present stage. The United States, this is how it's being viewed from Israel. The United States confuses democratic processes with democracy. Voting is not democracy. Voting perhaps should be the last step in a democratic process, and a democratic process can lead to different types of dictatorships worse than the one that it replaces. And it seems that the United States standing in the Middle East is on the decline. There are many questions about U.S. leadership and reliability, especially in times of crisis and upheaval. I'd like to spend a few minutes about specific issues. First issue is the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. Israel and the Palestinians have not been able to resume negotiations terminated at the end of the Bush administration. It seems that there are a number of reasons for it. The settlement issue is not one of them. From Jerusalem, it looks like the excessive emphasis by the Obama administration on settlements and the heavy pressure on Israel backfired. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in fact, accepted two major demands or requests from the Obama administration. He declared his support for the two-state solution, and he also declared freezing of settlements for about 10 months. Obama asked other Arab countries to take similar measures of confidence measure. None responded. In fact, Netanyahu was the only one to accept these requests. We know that the settlement issue has not been the main obstacle to peace because there was a freeze for 10 months. Still, the Palestinians did not come to the table. In the last month, they finally agreed to some indirect negotiations. It seems that there are more serious impediments to negotiations, which perhaps have been underestimated by the Obama administration. Basically, I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not ripe for resolution. This is a term taken from conflict resolution theories. The levels of concessions that the two sides are ready to give each other are insufficient to reach a comprehensive peace agreement. We know that already from the Olmert government negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas. It seems that the maximum that Israel is prepared to give does not meet the minimum that the Palestinians are demanding. There are other problems, serious problems, such as very weak Palestinian leadership. This is not the kind of leadership that could be expected to make those major concessions needed to reach a peaceful agreement. There's this split between Hamas and the Palestinians, where Hamas is really holding a veto power, because even if the Palestinian Authority in Israel reached an agreement, then they can fire missiles and undermine the whole thing. And it seems that the Palestinian strategy in recent months has been to avoid negotiations, to delegitimize Israel, both inside and outside, especially in international forums, and to obtain recognition from as many states as possible and from the United Nations in a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. Second issue which I want to talk about is linkage between resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Iran. The Obama administration claimed time and again that it needs a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to create a coalition in the Middle East of Arab allies of the United States to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. From the beginning, this claim has been suspicious because it assumes that the Arab states have no interest of their own in containing Iran, and that they would rather subjugate their own interest to the Palestinian interest, which has never been the case. But WikiLeaks documents have shown that Arab countries, allies of the United States, exerted pressure on the United States to take much tougher positions toward Iran. They did not need resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The next issue which I want briefly to touch upon is the effects of the current crisis on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Here we have a debate inside Israel. The left argues that this is another opportunity to resume negotiations and to reach an agreement not only with the Palestinians but also with the entire Arab world. This argument is based on the assumption that Arab leaders would be more willing now to help these negotiations. The left also argues that if indeed the Palestinian strategy were to succeed, then Israel would find itself in a very difficult and isolated position in the world. The right, on the other hand, argues that that the position or the effects should point to a very different directions. First of all, we see that there are some questions about peace agreements in the two countries that have signed peace agreements with Israel. Egypt and Jordan. Peace with Israel is not popular in the Arab world. And oddly enough, intellectuals and liberals have been against the peace and the translation of the peace agreements into people-to-people peace, which we call in professional terms warm peace. Peace not only between leaders, but also between peoples. And so, if this is the case, the question is what Arab leaders under pressure now would benefit or gain from participating in new efforts to reach comprehensive peace agreements between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The right also argues that what would be the value of agreements signed now with leaders whom you don't know if can survive the present phase of turmoil. What if you were to sign an agreement with Bashar Assad in Syria? What would be the fate of such an agreement? So we see this debate between left and right, but this is not new in Israeli politics. There have been always very heated debates about what Israel should do in a particular phase, one phase or another. I think then that the chances for resumed negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians will have to wait until we see where the developments in the Middle East will take us and what will be the United States standing in the world and in the Middle East following those events. And I'll be happy to answer questions a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to call upon Professor William Quandt. Professor Quandt is old hand in Middle Eastern affairs. He's professor at the University of Virginia. He served, among other things, as a staff member on the National Security Council, and he will speak about Obama's dilemmas in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Bill, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. I'll start by saying that I essentially agree with the previous speaker that if you came hoping to hear good news about the imminent revival of something that we used to call the peace process, I'm not going to be the one who steers you in that direction. This is a time when I think most of us look at the Middle East and see many other things that are commanding people's attention, but one of them is not right now the Arab-Israeli peace possibilities. Nonetheless, I want to talk a little bit about how this administration and generally how American administrations typically have approached the Arab-Israeli component of the various Middle East challenges that they face, because I think there are some general propositions here, and there are some very distinctive things about how Obama himself has tried to engage and now seems to be stepping back a bit. I think I would start by saying that the Arab-Israeli conflict, whatever a president and his or her, well, we haven't had a her yet, but his advisors may think, has a way of capturing their attention more than they perhaps would like. It's the kind of issue that, because of its domestic resonance and the sensitivity in the international community, cannot be easily delegated to a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. This is an issue that comes up to the presidential level repeatedly. And so presidents have to think through how they want to approach it. The other point I would make in a very general sense is that the Arab-Israeli issue is always part of a larger regional picture. And sometimes people make connections, the so-called linkage issue. Sometimes they try to isolate the Arab-Israeli issue and say, well, it doesn't really have much to do with what's happening in the Gulf or the democratization movements in the Middle East. But you have to think about the region as a whole, and within that region there is this issue of Israel-Palestine, Arab-Israeli conflict that has to be assessed as part of a kind of regional approach. And sometimes the regional issues become so much more intense, such as the Iranian Revolution of 1979, that they compete with or overshadow attempts to focus on the Arab-Israeli issue. When I was in government in the Carter administration, my colleague Gary Sick and I we worked in a little two-person office on the National Security Council staff, and I was doing Arab-Israeli things while he was doing Iran. And in 1978, that was a real challenge because I kept saying, my issue is more important. I was doing the Egyptian-Israeli stuff. My issues are more important, and it was pretty clear that his issues were pretty important, and we only had one president who only had so many hours in the day to pay attention. And that is also a reality, that issues sometimes compete with one another. And right now we have other issues that are obviously vying for top priority. Now, various American politicians and presidents have thought about the Arab-Israeli conflict in different ways. Some have thought that this is a conflict that, to use Professor Gilboa's words, is not ripe for resolution. I have some problems with that as a concept, but it's nonetheless true that a lot of people have told themselves that. And so therefore they think the proper approach is one of trying to manage or contain the conflict since it's not ready to be resolved. So you just want to try to do what you can to keep it from exploding. And by and large, that was the approach of American administrations from about 1950 to about 1973, with maybe a few exceptions. And then there are moments when we think the issue is so important that we need to try to at least start the process of trying to resolve all of it or part of it, or at least moderate the intensity of it. And I would say that from about 1973 to 2000, that was the dominant mindset of successive presidents. Different degrees of intensity, but there was a view that this is a problem that's important and we need to try to lend our weight to the resolution of the conflict in all or in part. particularly once the Egyptian-Israeli part of it got moving in a fairly serious direction. And then that effort kind of comes to an end at the end of 2000, and the Bush administration quite determinedly, and nobody made the obligatory announcement about cell phones, but I will remind you, if you haven't turned yours off, please do. From 2001 up until up until 2008, 9, we went through a period when, again, other issues in the Middle East trumped Arab-Israeli peace diplomacy, and we had a president and some of his inner circle who simply didn't think it was worth the time or energy, or that it was all that possible. But they didn't buy the linkage argument. And then Obama comes in, and Obama is an interesting case because in many ways, like we often see when a president from one party replaces a successor from a different party, there's a tendency to say, I'm going to do things very differently in foreign policy across the board. And in the Middle East, that meant toward Iraq and toward a lot of issues, including the Arab-Israeli issue, there was an expectation that Obama would be different. And his language was kind of a repeat of the language that you would have found in this period that I referred to as in the kind of 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the Clinton years, of the United States is going to try to help the parties get back on track with Arab-Israeli peacemaking. His rationale was a little bit different than previous presidents. He had sort of two themes. One was that the reputation of the United States in what he called the Muslim world, or the Arab Islamic world, had taken a big hit, which was true by any normal set of measures, partly because of the Iraq War and partly because of the perception over the previous 8 years or so that the United States was stepping back from its role of trying to broker an Arab-Israeli peace, and that part of his strategy of trying to restore the American image in this part of the world was to show that we were back in business leading something called the peace process, as well as eventually getting out of Iraq and so forth. The other argument, and it's interesting that the president didn't make it as much as some of his security people did, but you began to hear people like David Petraeus and Bob Gates say that there's a strategic issue here. When the United States is at war in two Muslim countries, it is important for us to be able to do all we can to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it will make it easier for our troops to do their job. Now, whether that is true or not is I'm not going to engage with right now, but it was interesting who was making the security argument. It was people who had very little to do with Arab-Israeli issues directly, but who were engaged in managing a war in Iraq and managing a war in Afghanistan. And so there was a kind of sense that there is a strategic and a reputational benefit if we can make progress in Arab-Israeli peacemaking. So what happened with these good intentions? And I think Obama wanted to try to push the peace process forward. First, he was caught by surprise by the Israeli elections early in his tenure when Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister. I think that he expected that he would be dealing with a Kadima-led government. He had been briefed on the Olmert-Abu Mazen talks by Condoleezza Rice, and her assessment is that they had gotten very close, and that therefore the Obama administration should pick up where that left off. Well, there wasn't anything to pick up and continue when Netanyahu first came in. He did, as we were reminded, convince Netanyahu to affirm his commitment to a two-state solution, but without any details of what that two-state solution would look like. And the settlement freeze, although it was a partial accomplishment, was not complete by any means. So Obama tries to use some degree of influence with Netanyahu to sort of show that he, as president, is the stronger party. Presidents tend to like to be taken seriously, and they like to show that they have influence. The problem in this case is that he took on an issue of settlements that he was not able to see through to an impressive conclusion. That is, when the dust finally settled, Netanyahu had made a partial concession, but not the full concession that the president and Hillary Clinton had asked for. So Obama, instead of looking strong, emerges toward the end of his first year looking rather weak. Third problem that he faced was the issue of weak leadership. Weak leadership on the Palestinian side, divided leadership, we've heard about that, but also I think weak leadership on the Israeli side. I think Netanyahu has been very good at resisting pressure. He has not been very good at forging a vision of what peace might look like, and I think there are reasons for that. He has a cabinet that is divided over this, and perhaps an Israeli public that is as well. So when you have strong divisions among the negotiating parties, it's a hard time to make peace. There was another problem on the American side, and this is kind of inside the Beltway considerations, but the Obama team dealing with the Middle East was probably not optimally organized. You had at least 4 or 5 different voices speaking out on what the policy was. You had George Mitchell, you had Secretary of State, you had National Security Advisor, you had the President himself, you had the very voluble Vice President, and you had Dennis Ross, who originally was supposed to be dealing with something called the Central Region, but pretty quickly is back dealing with Arab-Israeli issues. So you had, in some ways, too many voices and too little coherence. And that's a very typical but self-inflicted kind of problem that a president doesn't have to put up with, but they frequently do. And then I think there was a mistake made in the second year when the moratorium on settlements in the West Bank was beginning to come to an end, and they started pressing very, very hard for negotiations, as if negotiations would somehow, if you could just get the Israelis and the Palestinians to sit down together, this was going to miraculously unblock the problem. And of course, negotiations sounds like something you can't be against, but in this case, the disparity between the two parties is so great that unless you've done a fair amount of preparatory work, just putting the parties in the room together and expecting that they will literally negotiate face-to-face and resolve their problems is pretty much wishful thinking. You need some kind of, in my view, effective mediator to work between the two parties in order to structure the choices that each of them has, so that as they confront these truly existentially difficult choices, they not only understand the concessions they're going to have to make, but what they're going to get out of it. And if you just leave them talking to each other, I guarantee you it's not going to work that way. I think as I watch the clock, I have to drop a couple of my other points, but there was also a kind of amateurish moment. Okay, well, I don't want to take his minutes away. We'll have more discussion. Okay, I'll take a few more minutes. There was also, I think, a rather amateurish moment when you almost sort of sensed that the Obama administration in the fall of 2010 was beginning to get very nervous that its approach to getting negotiations started was falling apart, wasn't working, and they tried desperately to get Netanyahu to agree to a 3-month extension of the settlement freeze. And you think about it, how much value added would there be? You'd had 10 months of a settlement freeze. What was supposed to happen in the next 3 months? And in order to get that 3-month settlement freeze, an enormous set of, a number of offers were made that seemed more than you would expect for the mere 3-month settlement freeze. Military commitments, economic commitments, virtually a promise of an eventual security treaty. These are the kind of big items that I would expect to be part of a final peace agreement when Israel's making the truly difficult concessions on territory and whatever else, and then you come in and say, if you make those concessions, you can write whatever you want into this chapter on what the U.S. security relationship. Well, look, this was being offered for a 3-month extension of, and I thought it was amateur hour in spades. I mean, I couldn't understand why you were playing such big cards for such little gain, and we still got turned down. That, to me, was a lesson that the United States is losing its clout. It's losing its clout with Israel. We can't either bribe them or persuade them. Simultaneously, we were losing our clout practically everywhere else in the Middle East. The Iranians weren't afraid of what we were going to do if they didn't negotiate a freeze on their enrichment capabilities. The Lebanese, despite a lot of pressure from the United States, went ahead and formed a government with Hezbollah in it. And then governments started coming up against their own internal challenges, including pro-American regimes in Egypt and elsewhere. So I think I would argue that the results of this first 2 years left the United States in a position of less influence than we had probably at the outset of the Obama administration. New administrations tend to be, people take them seriously for a while as they try to get their measure, but after 2 years we had not done very well. And we entered this period of the so-called Arab Spring. Well, it's kind of a nice word for Arab upheavals, and some of it kind of feels like spring. It looks pretty good, but some of it looks pretty uncertain. But it meant that we entered that period with a fair amount of lack of credibility that the United States had a clear strategy. So where does this leave us now? I think it leaves us on the Arab-Israeli peace issues at an obvious impasse. There is no momentum. There's no party that has a strategy for breaking the impasse. And there are no obvious openings, although I think most, at least most people in my business, and I speak very much from an American analyst standpoint, if you said what would an eventual Israeli-Palestinian agreement look like, what would an eventual Syrian-Israeli agreement look like, we could probably describe within a 5 or 10% margin of difference what we think it would look like if it could be done at all. There aren't a whole lot of menus out there of, well, you could perhaps have this or this or this. If it's going to happen, it's going to look sort of like the Clinton parameters, the Olmert Abu Mazen with, you know, the gaps bridged. And on the Syrian front, in all honesty, it is actually quite easy to describe what it would look like. It's just you need to have a government in each place that is ready to do it. We are also, in the United States now, approaching that moment of paralysis called an election year. Hasn't quite hit us yet, but you can begin to see, I suspect those of you who have come from Israel have seen a few Republican candidates come to visit. That will continue, and I suspect even our president will, if he's invited, which I think he has been, make an appearance before he faces the electorate in next year. And during that period, he is not going to take on an ambitious project if it's going to be a controversial project. And in all honesty, everything in American politics now is controversial. If the president were to ask Congress to pass legislation tomorrow saying that motherhood is a good thing, he would be attacked for cheapening the notion of motherhood in some quarters. It is simply impossible these days to do anything without it becoming intensely politicized. So I think we're going to have a period of drift. We've had them before. Sometimes they end dramatically. Sometimes they end when we come to our senses and realize that there is still an issue called the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is still out there, and it still has important strategic implications. But I don't think it will be in Obama's first term that he is going to be able to do much about it. Were he to be reelected, and were he to have a new team of advisors, and were there to be some new actors in the region, we might once again see something called an American-led peace process. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Jonathan Reinhold. He's a senior lecturer in political studies at Bar-Ilan University and a senior associate at the Bessa Center.
Thank you, Ephraim. Both our previous speakers have defined themselves as pessimists. Well, I'd like to be an optimist, but an optimist according to the Israeli definition. And an optimist according to the Israeli definition of former Cabinet Minister Yosef Berg goes like this: I am an optimist. Yesterday will be better than tomorrow. Thank you. When we think about American policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict and American strategic interests, we think about conflict resolution on one hand and conflict management on the other hand. What I want to suggest is that actually what we have is a sliding scale, a range, a mix, and that one needs to find the right mix at the right time. If we look at the core American strategic interests in the Middle East, what we see is, number one, the protection of the flow of oil not only to the United States but to the world economy. Only one country can guarantee militarily that supply, and that is the United States. And we see the goal of preventing the spread and the use of weapons of mass destruction combined with missiles, and the prevention of terrorism against the United States and its allies. And I think it's pretty much widely accepted that in order to protect that, you need a strategy which maintains a pro-American balance of power in the Middle East and some version of stability, since, in effect, the status quo of 2 months ago is an American interest. It may not be great, but it's perfectly acceptable. The question is, where does the Arab-Israeli peace process fit in to this strategic picture? How important is it? How does it affect things? Now, a common argument made, particularly against the Bush administration, was that if only the Arab-Israeli conflict was resolved, it would be, as it were, a panacea for all the strategic difficulties of the United States in the region. All the instability in the region would dissolve, anti-Americanism would decline significantly, and one might add that Messiah would also come. And this then put pressure to find a resolution to the conflict. And as we've already heard, there's a tendency in American American politics that when a president of the opposite party comes in, he says, I will do the opposite of the previous president. Bush Jr. was anything but Clinton. Obama was anything but Bush Jr. And so this argument has been heavy in the air recently. What I want to suggest is that recent events and the WikiLeaks suggest that this is very much mistaken. It's very interesting, it's very telling that none of the demonstrations, none of the upheavals in the Arab world have been about the Palestinians. That is extremely significant. What they've been about is local issues, issues of development, education, unemployment, freedom. They are the issues about which the UN Arab Human Development reports, I should add, has written very widely about the failure of the development model in the Middle East. More broadly, if we look, we can see that what drives states in the region to act vociferously. Well, let's have a look at Saudi Arabia. Yeah, they put out a peace plan, but it was a peace plan that was designed so that they wouldn't actually have to do anything. It was a diktat, it was thrown out there, maybe an advertisement or two in the Jerusalem Post, but that was it. But when they had to confront Iran, things were different. Vocal support for Israel in the Second Lebanon War, and recently the use of Saudi troops in Bahrain. So it's clear that for another of America's key allies in the region, what really moves them is the threat of Iran, is the overall strategic picture in which there are allies of the United States, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and there are those who seek to challenge the order which is underwritten by the Americans, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. And what troubles America's allies primarily is that balance of power. It doesn't mean that they are unconcerned with the Arab-Israeli issue, but they look, and we should look, at the Arab-Israeli issue as part of a broader picture, not the picture. So when it comes to the United States and it having to decide what its policy priorities in a region are, the threat of a nuclear Pakistan, the threat of a nuclear Iran, the threat of losing a country like Egypt, which has been the cornerstone, along with Israel, of the pro-American balance of power in the Levant, in the Mediterranean, in that part of the Middle East where Israel sits. That cornerstone was put in place in 1975 by Henry Kissinger, because Israel and Egypt are the two strongest military powers. They both receive American arms, and therefore it's very difficult for them to go to war against each other in an extended way. And that power block creates a dynamic which says in the Arab world, you know what? You can't beat Israel militarily, so you have to either try and come to a full peace agreement or manage things in an acceptable way. And that has been at the cornerstone of the whole dynamic underwriting every attempt to make peace. And that cornerstone now has a crack in it. It is shaking. And that is very, very significant. Now, I'm not going to go into what's going on in Egypt. It's not my expertise, and I'm sure it's going to be spoken about. But if you want to understand the peace process, I've just been informed Hillel will speak about it, then when that foundation goes, everything else starts to shake. What are the implications of my analysis for looking at negotiations and how they're progressing? I think that we should think that it's not simply a diplomatic and political game. That's the way we generally talk about the peace process. We talk about, can Netanyahu deliver? Can Abbas deliver? What are their positions? Are they close enough? Are they not close enough? Clearly, those are very important questions, but we need to go down to the foundations. And we need to say, even if they were to reach certain agreements, can those agreements be sustained in a way that A, will last between the parties, and B, will maintain and reinforce the pro-American balance of power in the region? Because if they offer lots of opportunities to forces that are against stability and would like to overturn that, then not only will they overturn the pro-American balance of power, they will bring the whole piece down. And the particular issue I'm thinking of is the one of the Jordan Valley. And the Jordan Valley, in Israeli strategic thinking since the Six-Day War, has been thought of as Israel's security border. And that is the massing of Israel's existential nightmare, is the massing of Arab armies in Jordan that would pose a threat, because without the West Bank, Israel is 9 to 10 miles wide at its narrowest point. And that concern meant that someone like Yitzhak Rabin always said that the Jordan Valley would be Israel's security border, and there was an argument whether a security border Israel needs to have sovereignty or doesn't need to have sovereignty. But recently there's been talk about international forces being put in to the Jordan Valley as a replacement for Israeli troops. I think though what's happened in the region should give us a great pause for thought about whether that is a good idea, not only for Israel, but actually for everybody. Because if one looks at what's happened in Lebanon, with the weakness of international forces preventing the importation of missiles, if one looks what happens when international forces are challenged the world over, if you look at what happened in the former Yugoslavia, they're not willing to fight in a way that their enemies are willing to fight. They're not prepared to lose people. They're not prepared to kill people to the same degree of their enemies. And therefore the will and the political commitment, I think, would not be there to withstand efforts to infiltrate into the West Bank radical forces, missiles, and the rest of it in a way that would directly threaten Israeli population centers, and which would, of course, mean an Israeli response to protect its citizens. So I think it is highly unwise to look at the Jordan Valley and say, yes, an international force can resolve this. And given that Abbas has at least publicly stated that he will not accept Israeli forces in the Jordan Valley and that he would only accept an international force, I think that for this, aside from all the other reasons that my colleague Eitan mentioned about why, and also Professor Quant, about why a permanent status agreement is not possible, this is another one that we should think of in an underlying sense as opposed to a political or diplomatic sense. But as I've said, conflict resolution and conflict management are two outer boundaries. Between them are many options. And the problem, or the issue, if you like, is that there isn't an option of doing nothing on the peace process, not for long. Because conflict management requires at least the semblance of conflict resolution. It requires a peace process because a vacuum has political consequences and strategic consequences. When people are talking, that creates a political focus. When they're not, it creates openings for people who'd like to cause trouble. And particularly at the moment, when one sees all this instability going on, although it would be a mistake to say everything, as I said, depends on what goes on between Israelis and Palestinians, it's important for those who want to have a stable Middle East, which can move forward in a positive direction, to take away from extremists cards that they could use to stir things up. And therefore, I think that there is nonetheless an American interest in having a semblance of a peace process, which needs, of course, a certain amount of credibility. And if one takes a step back from the all-or-nothing approach of permanent status, then I personally believe that there is, if you think of the peace process as a Venn diagram, a space where Israel's core interests, Palestinians' core interests, those of Abbas and Fayyad, and the American core interests actually do intersect. Now, I'm not promising you, being the Middle East, that this can actually, the intersection of interests means everyone will be rational and follow a solution, but I think such an intersection does exist, and it exists on a number of levels. First of all, we're all on the same side in the broader regional fight. None of us wish Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah to get stronger. So keeping Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran weak and dealing with them is a strategic interest of all concerned. Second of all, Israel's core interest, if you read Netanyahu's speech that he gave at the Begin-Sadat Center very carefully, you'll see that the core issues for him are Israeli security and Israel's definition as a Jewish and democratic state, which translates into the refugee question. What was not a core issue was settlements. That's very significant. And he got a standing ovation. And there was silence in Israel. And we had a 10-month settlement freeze. There's a very interesting coalition of people who are interested in an interim agreement in Israel. It ranges from Yossi Beilin, who is the godfather of the Oslo process, maybe the main advocate in Israel previously of a permanent status agreement, ranging across the Israeli center to Shaul Mofaz, the former chief of staff and number 2 in Kadima, including 2 of Israel's most renowned journalists, Ehud Yaari and Ari Shavit, across to the bête noire of the world, the Israeli foreign minister Avigdor Lieberman. And although there are differences between what they're talking about, there is some common parameters. One is the creation of a Palestinian state in interim borders. According to the second stage of the roadmap, we'd be talking, I imagine, about 60 to 70-something%, the barrier, excluding the barrier and the Jordan Valley, which would provide something like 98% contiguity for Palestinian citizens in the West Bank. We were talking about having to deal with the status of around 50,000 settlers, which is probably around half of what would have to be dealt with according to the parameters that Professor Quant referred to before in a permanent status agreement. And we would have a choice about whether settlements would be taken down or whether they would be transferred to Palestinian sovereignty. My sense is the government would prefer the latter. I personally always conceive of the peace process as the divorce process and therefore would prefer the former, a clean line, a clean break. But of course there are political considerations. But one shouldn't belittle the fact that a centre-right government has political capital and legitimacy to do things that it would be much more difficult for a centre-left or left government to do, and one only has to think of the disengagement to be reminded of that fact. Now, of course, while there's broad support on the Israeli side for an interim agreement, there's only one slight problem, and that is there's no support on the Palestinian side for an interim agreement. And Israel and the Palestinians actually have similar concerns. Israelis who are against an interim agreement fear that Israel will be giving up its cards, which are territory, and therefore would be in a weaker position in permanent status. And the Palestinians are concerned that an interim agreement will be a final agreement and they will get trapped into that and they will not get what they feel they deserve. My own view is that those two issues, in a sense, balance each other out. Those concerns have a certain balance, and that therefore that needn't be essentially a problem. My sense is that the conversations going on right now between the Israeli government and Dennis Ross are quite important, and that they may well be about this interim idea. And my sense is that Israel was to put on the table a significant prospect which involved dealing with a large amount of settlers and settlements, that the United States would take this on board, given that they don't have a good idea of what's going on now, and given that the alternative of a Palestinian attempt to push through the General Assembly unilaterally the idea of a Palestinian state in 67 borders with East Jerusalem would be the equivalent of throwing the cards in the air at a particular time when the region is unstable, and my sense is that most countries would prefer not to do that. And therefore I do think that if the Prime Minister does come out with an initiative along the lines that I have laid out, that it could actually provide a basis for conflict management, at the same time contributing in the longer term to conflict resolution, while at the same time preserving and perhaps even enhancing the pro-American balance of power in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. We'll start now the Q&A period. Please, if anybody has a question, there is a microphone here in the middle. Go there and I'll allow you to ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question. You say your name Reinhold? Or
Yes, Reinhold. Yeah.
I think what you said, the very last point about the interim agreement, I think what's appealing about that is that it gives the Palestinians cover. There's so much terrible incitement in the media and everything against Israel, just awful, awful things, that it's sort of, they can turn to their people and say, look, this isn't the whole, there's just an interim
Please
agreement.
try to make it a question, okay?
Yeah, do you agree with that, basically, that it gives the Palestinians cover?
We'll take a few questions and afterwards we'll take a round of answers. Please. Yeah. Can you identify yourself?
My name is Kenneth Bialton. I'd like to ask everyone, but Professor Quant brought up the issue. We're talking about a discussion of the Arab-Israeli peace treaty and how important it is or isn't while the world is burning. My question is, can anyone objectively, historically, geopolitically, strategically tell me why it is important, relevant, immediate, and necessary for that issue to even be on the international table now, when there are so many other things, that create the impasse or create the unlikelihood of unsettlement? Where does the geopolitical strategic urgency exist for us to talk about this? If I could put it in context 1 second, I was at the meeting of Jewish leaders with the president a few weeks ago. I was present at a sidebar conversation. Somebody said to the president as he was walking out, Mr. President, you were very sincere, but and even if people don't agree with you, what we appreciate your being here. And he said, what is it you don't agree with? And the answer was, the settlements. Why are you worrying about this when Rome is burning? Why are you pushing them? Nobody cares. WikiLeaks tells us nobody cares, so why are you pushing it? And he said, the Palestinians care, even if nobody else does. And because he made it clear in the meeting that he was going to continue to push that issue.
Okay. Professor Jervis.
I have two questions, related questions on the American role. What about the counter-argument that the Arabs and the Palestinians and the Israelis come closer to agreement when we're not involved, with the exception of Camp David, which we can attribute to Bill's presence, that, look at Oslo, Taba, and the negotiations between Olmert and Abu Mazen, it looks like they come closest when we're not in the room. Now, that wouldn't preclude the role that Bill suggested of our coming in as a guarantor and sweetener at the end, but I wonder if perhaps we're an enabler in the bad sense as well as the good sense. And the related question, historically, is there any time looking back when you, any of you, can say if the U.S. had done something different, we might have gotten an agreement?
Okay, the last one for this. We'll have another round.
Hi.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Abe Wagner. Bill mentioned quite correctly that there have been 2 Republican hopefuls so far in Jerusalem, probably more coming. And both of the Republican hopefuls have made, both in Jerusalem and on their return, radically different statements about their view of the settlement and the peace process. Is the view in Jerusalem, do you think now, anybody looking beyond an Obama administration to the possibility of a future Republican administration where these sorts of views may in fact be the basis of U.S. policy towards settlement?
Okay, our panelists will answer.
I'll make brief responses. First of all, about interim agreement. Yes, if the choice is between the continuation of the status quo or violence, it's always better to have an interim agreement. There are good interests for both sides to search for an interim agreement, providing that, and we had it in the past, we had a huge debate about these alternatives to negotiations. One strike comprehensive agreement, settling every issue, or going step by step, which was the original Kissinger's idea. The problem with step by step is that, first of all, you are required to make concessions, and you start with the least difficult issues. So by the time you get to the most difficult issues, you run out of concessions. Number 2, if you don't see the end result of the process, then it's very difficult to move through the stages. So I think that interim agreement right now would be feasible if indeed the 2 sides can also agree about at least the basic structure of the final peace agreement. Otherwise, I don't think it might work. Why there is geopolitical urgency for peacemaking? If the status quo is likely to produce wars and violence, then it's always better to engage in negotiations and peacemaking. Usually, sides to a conflict enter negotiations after war, if there is a big danger or threat of a war, or when there is opportunity. And it seems that the Obama administration felt at the beginning of his tenure at the White House that there was a great opportunity and danger together to reach a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace agreement because of Iran. Iran represented a major threat, so that the sides would be more willing to negotiate an agreement. Maybe this agreement will also be supported by the Arab states. Now, Professor Jarvis's point is very interesting. Yes, the 2 big initiatives that, in fact, produced the peace agreement, the Sadat visit to Jerusalem, and the Oslo process came from the Middle East itself. I once wrote that the U.S. role in the process is function of 2 things: the level and scope of differences between or among the sides. And then the question is always at what point you come in order to push for an agreement. If, when you start negotiations, you go like this. Some of the problems in the Middle East were that you start negotiations, you go like this, and then you go like that, then you go like this. So it never goes like this, and you end with a final push into an agreement. When the United States is here somewhere, it's not helpful. But as we have seen with the Camp David process, And even with the Oslo process, when the United States can come in at the end, you need just a little push, and you need guarantees, and you need commitments from the United States to compensate for the concessions that the two sides are unable to make. Then I think the contribution of U.S. mediation is enhanced. Now, I don't think that anybody in Israel thinks about the post-elections in the United States. Israel has had elections almost every 2 years in the last decade or so. So the time frame is about two and a half years, no more than that. But there is a concern about the declining standing of the United States in the Middle East and maybe in the world, because it seems that Israel's ability to make concessions for a genuine peace agreement depend on American strength and American leadership and American commitments in the Middle East. And right now there are many questions asked, I think, not only in Israel, but also in the whole region, where the United States is going. Will the United States continue to be a world leader? Can the United States be relied upon for whatever commitments or guarantees that are essential, needed to reach a peace agreement? Thanks.
Bill.
Well, I'll just pick up a few of the questions and say a few things about them, and maybe reflect on a point or two from the earlier conversation as well. You know, if everybody were to agree, Israelis and Palestinians, that an interim agreement is the way to go, I don't think there's a principled American objection to steps of that sort. What I think does exist now is a certain skepticism that it's going to happen, or that you get very much in return for initiatives of that sort. So I don't think it's going to be an American-led effort. If Jonathan's right that it's a great idea and there's this overlapping space and we'll eventually come to it, the United States will not be the party that vetoes it if the others want it. But I honestly think this is used goods. People have talked about it. It's never happened. It's built on a model of confidence building, that little steps lead you to be more courageous about taking big steps. And honestly, it's not true. It hasn't worked. It didn't work in the 1990s when it was the dominant paradigm. Parties, as they got closer to the hard decisions, were actually more distrustful than they had been at the beginning. So I think it's a real hard sell, first and foremost with the Palestinians, who are, as we've all noted, in a weak situation. Oddly enough, the one party on the Palestinian side that would be kind of open to it, most of you won't agree with this, is probably Hamas. Hamas doesn't believe that a final peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians is possible. They do believe that prolonged periods of kind of tacit understandings might be possible. And if that's what an interim initiative ends up looking like, it's kind of a tacit understanding for a period of time, they might be the ones who would not be so much in opposition. But Abu Mazen himself has said quite explicitly that he's not going to be interested, and he may not be around for very much longer in any case. Why do this at all? I don't think there is very much motivation right now. We've heard the reasons why in earlier periods people thought it was important. And I think the president actually told this gentleman something that shouldn't be ignored. You know, this still does matter for Palestinians, and quite frankly, it still matters for Israelis that this conflict be brought to an end. Also, I think I disagree a little bit with my colleagues who have said that WikiLeaks kind of proves that nobody in the Arab world cares about the Palestinian issue anymore. We're talking about regimes who are talking with Americans about very specific issues. We're not sampling public opinion in Egypt or Jordan or elsewhere. Were you to do so, and people have done it, you would find that there's still quite a bit of concern, and if ordinary people didn't have it every day, they would see it on Al Jazeera, and in all honesty, that has an impact in the Arab world. So as Egypt becomes more democratic, don't think this issue becomes less important. It will become part of the new Egyptian government's foreign policy line, that we've got to get back to Arab-Israeli peacemaking because they will be reflecting more the public sentiment at home. I don't think that means that suddenly things are going to change, but the issue is not going to go away. And I have a feeling that a fair number of people who have spoken would like to see it sort of drift off into obscurity while we deal with other issues, but I don't think that's going to happen. Bob Jervis raises the interesting point of, has the American effort been sort of counterproductive? That is, the parties do better on their own. I'm probably a biased observer. I was involved in the Egyptian-Israeli thing, and I honestly don't believe that they could have brought it to a conclusion in 1978-79 without the United States doing a pretty intensive job of mediation. And if anybody wants the long version on that, I can refer them to what I've written, or I can have a side conversation with you. But that's just my judgment about that moment. Oslo was an exception. Also note, Oslo didn't work. It wasn't carried to a conclusion. It was a starting point, but it never got very much beyond. And when the parties started to try to implement Oslo, they accepted an American role in trying to move it forward. Where were the moments, in response to Bob Jervis's question, when the United States might have made a difference? I think that there were two moments in the last 20 years when, if the United States had played its hand differently, we might have seen peace agreements achieved, at least on one front, if not more. That was in the Rabin 1993 to 95 period, and particularly on the Syrian-Israeli front, after Rabin had made his decision and had communicated it to the United States that he would accept the June 4th, 1967 line. Warren Christopher, hate to say anything bad about somebody who's just passed away, but he was not a very strategic thinker about this. This was a fairly significant moment when an American-led initiative to deal with Syria might have moved that conflict very close to being susceptible to resolution. Had that happened in 1994-95, these are a lot of ifs, it also would have changed the dynamic on the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, because they would have then been the last party out, and all of Arafat's playing for time and his duplicity would have cost him an awful lot at that point. And I think you might have had one of those rare moments when you would have had a strong president leading with a strong Israeli prime minister, a strong Syrian leader, and yes, Arafat, with all of his weirdness, was at that time a strong political leader. He could have delivered. So I look back at that period and say, we never fully exploited the potential that was given us by the fact that we had this alignment of forces that might have given us a chance to play the broker's role effectively. The last chance, and I really do think it's the last one that is worth reflecting on, was early 2000, when Clinton once again decided time is coming, is passing. If I'm going to do anything to kind of leave a legacy, I've got to do it quickly. And once again, he got remarkably close on the Syrian-Israeli front. I mean, I've just finished writing something in detail about this. I think they had a deal in the makings. They didn't quite have all the pieces, but they were pretty close. And they screwed it up. They, meaning Barak, screwed it up, Assad screwed it up, and Clinton screwed it up, but Clinton was, was at fault in the way he handled the last Shepherdstown negotiation and his summit meeting with Assad. From then on, I'm not sure there have been good openings, but those, had they been concluded at that time, they would have made a difference.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. The question of whether an interim agreement gives Palestinians cover, I think, as Professor Kwon said, they're not in favor right now. I think the thing that is good for them is they don't really have to give anything. They just get. And all that they have to demonstrate is that it's not the end. So I think that that's the advantage from their point of view, and because I'm extraordinarily skeptical that they can make the kind of requirements that even an Olmert government, let alone a Netanyahu government, can live with, I think it's the only option, really. However, unlikely, or however, I should say, however, while accepting that even though I think it's in everyone's interest, it's probably less than 50% likely to happen. Why do we have to deal with this? Well, as I said, I don't think it is a key strategic priority for the US, but the US has to nonetheless deal with it to prevent it becoming an irritant in lots of other things. But it is very key for Israel and for the Palestinians, and because I think partition is ultimately a vital interest of the state of Israel. Anything that moves us closer to that from an Israeli perspective, as opposed to American perspective, is a positive thing, particularly if it moves us closer in a way without taking serious strategic threats, just political difficulties. Would it make a difference? What happens when the US is involved or not involved? I don't believe that the United States could have done anything to make an agreement happen when an agreement didn't happen. I think that the mantra of all American Secretary of State since James Baker, that we can't make peace for the parties, we can assist, we can facilitate, is absolutely correct. And it's just wishful thinking. Otherwise, it does. However, America makes a difference. There's no doubt that America makes a difference. But what happens is not so much that you can help make peace, but you can help prevent things deteriorating. You can make differences. I think going forward with Camp David too, when things were not properly thought out or ready or ripe or whatever you want to say, was a mistake. It was a well-meaning mistake, but it was a mistake. And it might have been wiser to look for ways to prevent that. I can't guarantee you that there wouldn't have been a second intifada, but I think that it could have made a difference. Sometimes it's better to be more modest. Republican statements. Look, Israelis will be bemused by American, political leaders coming and saying various things that talk to American politics but not to Israeli political realities. It's not that the evangelical right in the United States is as important as some people say, but it is worth bearing in mind that there are more evangelical Christians who believe in the whole land of Israel than there are Jews in the world. So, the resonance of that particular message is going to resonate better in the in the South here than it is in Jerusalem. And that's something to bear in mind in understanding how perhaps Israelis look at it. And if George W. Bush couldn't eat that much into the American Jewish vote, I'm skeptical that anyone else will be able to, unless Obama makes mistakes along the lines that Jimmy Carter did. It's up to the Democratic candidate to lose the Jewish vote. It's much more difficult for the Republican candidate to win it. I don't think it's about trust. I don't think the reason that I think that an interim agreement is a good idea is not because I think that trust and it builds trust. It's because I think it creates a situation on the ground where Israelis, Palestinians, and American allies are better off. Everyone gains something, and that might actually create an environment where the very fragile but nonetheless positive moves taken by Fayyad on the ground have a chance of developing in a way that will assist eventually Israeli-Palestinian coexistence. One of the phrases that Tzipi Livni used, I don't know if she used it publicly, but she certainly used it privately, is there's nobody to give the keys to. And that is, if from an Israeli perspective, and the consensus in Israel is this, that partition is a vital interest of the state of Israel. If that's the case, the key issue for Israelis is, can we give someone the keys without getting a missile on my house? And that's the issue that's the mainstream Israeli political issue. It's not about settlements, although that is an important issue in the negotiations. But that's the crux issue for Israelis. And if you create an interim period in which Palestinian economy in the West Bank and governance improve and Israeli security improves, and I'm being beyond optimistic here, then I think that is a positive foundation, not for building trust for some agreement down the line, but for putting in the deep type of strategic foundations that can make that sort of thing stand eventually. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions.
Hillel Frisch from Bessa. As you know, people have spoken about a partition between Israel and the Palestinians, but the only partition so far has been the partition between the Palestinians. There's been an inter-Palestinian partition, but no Israeli-Palestinian partition. And given the durability of political entities in the Middle East, more durable, in fact, than in Europe, how does the peace process continue, given that there are two feudal statelets, one in Gaza and one in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, who are effectively in civil war, and bloodshed is only being prevented because Israel holds the Negev?
Please, introduce yourself, please.
Joe Blady, does time favor one side as opposed to the other? And is it possible that mutual exhaustion will play a major role ultimately, as it did, for example, in Ireland?
My name is Gil Kulik, and the question is addressed to the Israeli members of the panel. I'm wondering if you're at all concerned about the impact that the occupation is having on Israeli society. There are many of us who are quite alarmed at the steady erosion of democratic values, as manifested by the number of bills before the Knesset that would limit freedom of speech, that would punish dissent and so forth. I believe that this is an existential threat to the democratic Jewish state of Israel, and I'm wondering whether either of you agree that this should lend some urgency to the need to reach an agreement, notwithstanding all of the problems that you've enumerated.
Okay. Take.
The first question was about the split in the Palestinian community. I think this is a major obstacle to peace. The typical American approach to this problem has been, I've spoken to a number of officials, and even I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that once there is an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, then it's going to be some kind of a democratic decision. There are going to be some kind of an elections or referendum on a treaty, and this will force, so to speak, the issue on Hamas. The second answer was that given a peace agreement, then perhaps Hamas and the Palestinian Fatah will join a government, will make a government of national unity. Some people suggest that this is what they are working on right now, a government of national unity. The problem with that idea is that who is going to dominate this government of national unity? Maybe the U.S. thinks it's going to be Fatah, but Hamas has other ideas, and Hamas is much stronger even in the West Bank than Hamas, because of all kinds of reasons. Than the PA, yes. So this, I think this is the major problem that I don't know if there is a solution to that, but I think that this is a major obstacle on the road to a peace agreement. One of the Israeli concerns, which Jonathan made earlier, is if you have a peace agreement today and Israel were to withdraw from all of the West Bank, are we going to see another version of Hamas's Gaza there? And how you can be sure that this is not going to happen? Obviously, both sides think that time plays into their favor. Because if this had not been the case, we might have seen more pressure to negotiate and to reach an agreement. Some people, some Palestinians suggest that the two-state solution should be abandoned and that the one-state solution should be adopted, counting on demography and some kind of developments, maybe in the international arena, such as UN recognition of a Palestinian state within 1967 borders somehow will create conditions on the ground that would be much more favorable to their demands. Some Israelis believe that time works in their favor, and that eventually the Palestinians would reach a conclusion, would conclude that there's no way to impose their demands on Israel, and that somehow a compromise is going to be reached. So I think this is another obstacle to negotiations, to resuming negotiations right now. The impact of the occupation on Israeli society, this has been highly exaggerated in Israel and abroad. It's being made by people who are in favor of peace now. Obviously, there are all kinds of problems, but Israel withdrew from Gaza. It withdrew from some parts of the West Bank. There are some problems that emerge from the need to establish security in the West Bank. And I think those who emphasize settlements and occupation have no idea what's going on in the Middle East and do not understand the real forces that either block or promote negotiations between the two sides.
On the first question of how much of the blockage in the peace process is due to the fact that the Palestinians are divided, of course it makes it harder for them to negotiate, but quite frankly, we didn't see a big dynamic move toward Israeli-Palestinian peace when the Palestinians weren't so divided. If you go back to when the PLO was a more or less unified movement, the basic substantive issues dividing Israelis and Palestinians were still there. Abu Mazen's positions on most of these are no different from more or less what Arafat's positions were on terms of the 67 borders, East Jerusalem, some limited right of return, rejecting Israeli troops in the West Bank and so forth. So that didn't really change from, say, the early 1990s when Hamas was not a very big figure to today when it is a bigger figure. So yes, it complicates the notion of kind of getting a coherent Palestinian voice into the negotiations, but I think it's less the determining factor than has been implied by some of the other speakers. Who does time favor in this? You know, looking at this as an outsider, I don't actually think that time is on either side, in the sense that if we just sit back and let 10 or 15 years unfold, let nature take its course, if we can imagine that happening, that one side will emerge saying, wow, it was really worth it, we're in great shape now. I think we're more likely to see 10 or 15 years from now something that looks quite similar to what we have today. Now, if you think it's pretty good today, maybe it'll be okay then. But certainly for many Palestinians, it's not very good. For some Israelis, it's not very good. For the region as a whole, it remains a kind of irritant. And I'm afraid that's what time favors, is just more of the same. Not that one side will give up. This is not the kind of conflict where one is going to say, oh my gosh, we finally came to our senses and realized we're on the wrong side of history and we're going to abandon our goals. It's not going to happen. Palestinians will never be strong enough on their own to reverse the trends we're talking about. The one thing we can be quite sure of is, as time goes on, the settlement process, which people again have been saying isn't so important, but I can tell you, based on the past, every year there will be 10 to 15,000 more settlers living in the West Bank. So project that forward another 20 years, and you're going to have another 200,000 to 300,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. And it makes it almost inconceivable at that point that what we were told, that for Netanyahu, settlements are not an issue. Well, they may not be an issue for him, but they're going to be for Israeli society, because you'll have, you know, upwards to 1 million people living beyond the old Green Line. So time changes some of the contours of the conflict. It doesn't solve the conflict. People talk about there will be a two-state solution, there will be a one-state solution. I think you're going to have an outcome in the absence of a political agreement in which Israel remains the strongest party in its immediate vicinity. Gaza remains as it is, although Egypt may open the Rafah crossing and make it a little less constrained. And the West Bank will look pretty much as it is. A lot of the young generation will leave because it's not a very viable place to set up businesses and raise your families. And that in the immediate surrounding areas, particularly in Lebanon, there will be a spillover effect because there are lots of Palestinians there, and the kind of problems we see now that stem from this unresolved conflict will still be there. In the rest of the region, Israel will have no regional partners of significance. Egypt will not be a real, I don't think they'll go back on their peace, but I think it'll be an even colder peace than it is now. Iran, unless something dramatic happens, is going to be an adversary, and perhaps a more dangerous adversary. And the way things are going now, Turkey, which 5 years ago had pretty good relations with Israel, is also going to be a rather cool, standoffish party in the region. So I'm afraid I see a Middle East emerging in which we actually have three centers of power with ambitions in the region: Iran, Egypt, a new Egypt, and Turkey. Israel locked into its conflicts in its immediate environment, but with no good relations with anyone else in the region, and the United States, which is getting fed up with the region. We'll concentrate on the oil issue because it's strategically important, and therefore we'll focus on security access to the Gulf region, but we'll cease to have the ambition of remaking the Middle East the way George W. Bush, I think, mistakenly did, thinking that the United States is so strong that it can remake the Middle East to suit itself. That overreach in the Bush period is going to lead to a disengagement now. Ask yourself how many Americans today are concerned about Iraq, where we spent $1 trillion and still have 50,000 troops left. People just want out. I'm not saying that's a wise policy, but we are going to be out of Iraq. Afghanistan, similarly. We went into Afghanistan for reasons of national interest. People are losing interest, and I think we will be out of Afghanistan within 5 years, if not sooner. So the United States is, I think, in retreat. There are reasons for that. An ambitious foreign policy is expensive. And as people keep reminding us, we're kind of broke these days. So you're going to see a lot of hesitation, even under a future Republican president, say, let's go in and remake Iran. Let's go in and remake Syria. I think for the foreseeable future, the United States is going to limit its foreign policy goals to things that are truly high priority or not very expensive. And that probably means we are going to be a bit more distant in our relations with the Middle East than some of you might like, but I think it's happening. And so time is going to affect the American involvement in the Middle East. I think we're a retreating power. Nobody else is going to step in and take over that role. But within the region, I do think there are going to be three significant powers that try to shape the arena, and there will be a lot of competition over countries like Syria and Iraq, Jordan, and the Gulf region. And that's where the great game is going to play itself out. And in that region, Israel's going to be behind its barrier and with its deterrent capabilities, but without allies in the region.
Okay, Hamas. As I said, I think that part of the whole point of an interim thing is that it doesn't have the problem that you have to deal with a unified Palestinian government because it's only an interim agreement to do with the West Bank. But I do feel that over time, if that experiment was to succeed, that would help. I mean, it could take a very long time. It took a very long time for West Germany to be the successful experiment and East Germany to collapse. Time is a complicated thing. I think Professor Quant said nearly everything that I would say on the subject, except that I would say that for Israel, I mean, Ephraim thinks that time is on Israel's side. I'm kind of more of a double pessimist in that I think that time is not on Israel's side, particularly on the issue of settlements, partition that we spoke about. On the other hand, it's not as if there is a clear-cut way of breaking out of that. There might be better ways of managing it and minimizing its effect, which is what I've suggested. And this goes to the last point about the effect of the occupation on Israeli society. When you use the term the occupation, you imply that if Israel suddenly was not occupying, that all these problems would go away. And since I fundamentally disagree with that, I think that's a fundamentally mistaken perception. The problem is the conflict and what the conflict does to Israeli society. The reason for the trends in Israeli society is because of what's happened in the last 10 years in the conflict. The collapse of the peace process, the increasing identification of Israeli Arabs with Hamas and Hezbollah, not the majority, but some of the statements of the leaders and some of the things that went on in the wars, including Azmi Bishara, a former member of parliament who's had to leave the country because otherwise he'll be tried for treason. All sorts of things like that. It's not like somehow Israel is the key actor and everything, the whole rest of the conflict depends exactly on what we do or we don't do. Of course, it depends partly on what we do. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think one of the things that's happening in Israeli society is the heightened threat perception is causing people to be threatened, feel threatened more, and that's closing down some of the civic space in a variety of ways. But it comes from fears and threats, and it's not unique to Israel. If one looks, there's some interesting academic articles have been written about levels of insecurity in democracy, and one of the reasons that Britain and America are stable democracies is because they were safe for a very long time. Not the only reason, but it took one of the main things away. So I think that we have a definite dilemma, problem, issue, but unfortunately we can't just wave our wand and it will go away. It's not quite as simple as that.
Okay, I think we had enough spiritual food, and we have a break, 15 minutes. We'll be back.